This program is brought to you by Emory University.
We all know William Shakespeare, the most famous author of all time, writer of 37 plays, 154 sonnets, several epic poems, and why we are here today. But what if I told you Shakespeare never wrote a single word?
Roland Emmerich's movie, Anonymous, runs with the premise that Shakespeare was not the original author of Shakespeare's plays, and that's not at all a new idea. But I guess I'd have to say offhand that I don't think there's much, one should give much credence to this idea. The idea has been around a long time. It has been around at least since the late 19th century. And the idea that Oxford, the Earl of Oxford, is the real Shakespeare, which is the premise of Anonymous, dates back to about 1920. It was espoused by someone named Thomas Looney, although it's not quite fair. His name spells Looney, but I believe it's correctly pronounced Loney. But in any case, he was a man who was fiercely against modernity and fiercely against democracy in many ways. And he simply could not get his mind around the fact that someone could write Shakespeare's plays and not be a nobleman and not have this fantastic education. So he put forth the Earl of Oxford, Thomas de Vere, and so people who believe this are called Oxfordians. And then with that came the idea that people who believe that Shakespeare is Shakespeare are then Stratfordians, or the place of Shakespeare's origin. One of the things people who believe Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's works often say is that Shakespeare was not smart enough to have written the works based on his education. It is true that Shakespeare did not receive a university education. In fact, he did not even receive a grammar school education, as far as we know in writing. However, as far as we know, there's no evidence that just about anybody went to grammar school in that period, although we know they did. Schools existed, Shakespeare's father was prominent, there's no reason to suspect he would not have received the basic grammar school education. And what many people don't know is that the basic grammar school education in Shakespeare's day meant that Shakespeare learned a great deal, far more than we can imagine now. In fact, I often tell my undergraduates he probably had a better education than they did, because he would have learned the classics inside out. He would have studied Ovid, he would have studied some Greek as well. And he would have had a host of other kinds of introductions to other kinds of tales and narratives and so on. So that merely having a grammar school education in Shakespeare's day meant that one was, by our standards, quite learned. Other reasons people put forth for saying Shakespeare didn't write his plays have to do with things like there was no, as far as we know, there's no evidence that anybody wrote a eulogy or an elegy about him immediately after he died in 1616. This is true. However, when the first folio, the collected editions, the sort of very fancy collected editions of his works were published posthumously, there were indeed all kinds of people writing poems about how great he was, including most famously Ben Jonson, another playwright and poet, whose works we value highly. So to say that his name is not attached to his works isn't exactly quite right. Other people mention him all the time. Several of the plays published in his lifetime have his name on them. So I think that that again is one reason why it's hard to one really has to imagine that the facts are not the facts in order to say that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare's plays.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.